Hey everyone,
Hey everybody.
welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're going to be going over some of the most common myths that we hear about travel therapy. We've been in the industry now for 10 years. We still have people ask questions all the time, and these are some of the most common concerns that we hear that aren't really true or are overblown, I would say. So we're going to go through those. Whitney's going to introduce us, and then we'll get into the top 10 myths in travel therapy.
All right, for those that may not know us, we are Whitney and Jared Casazza. We're both traveling physical therapists. We've been involved in the travel therapy industry for about 10 years now. We started as travel PTs in 2015, right away when we were new grads. And then over the years, we started a blog and we started our business, Travel Therapy Mentor, to mentor and educate other clinicians and students that are thinking about getting into travel therapy, as well as current travelers. So if you are new to our platforms, welcome. For those of you that have been involved in our channel for a long time, welcome back. If you are watching live, we are live on both Facebook and Instagram today. If you're watching live, we'd love if you'd say hello in the comments. Just let us know you're there. We'd also like to hear from you. Are you a current traveler? Are you somebody who's thinking about getting into travel? Are you a student? Are you a clinician? Let us know in the comments. Also, feel free to comment if you are watching live later, and then shout out to those of you that will listen on the podcast and YouTube as well.
Also, as we go through, let us know, especially if you're a current traveler, if you agree or disagree with these that we've come up with.
Yeah, we made a post about this the other day, and we just kind of hit on like the top 3, but then we also got some feedback from a few current travelers on what they considered to be some other ones. So we decided to expand on that list, and we came up with 10. And then each one of these will kind of spark a little bit of background information and additional education for you guys. So hopefully this will be helpful.
Okay, so the first myth that we hear definitely the most often, that we also heard when we were new grads, back when we were in PT school, second year PT students in like 2014, people were telling us that you should not travel as a new grad.
And shout out to Connor that just commented and said, hi, I'm a current second year student thinking about starting travel as a new grad. We were definitely in your shoes, Connor.
Yep. So people told us you should not travel as a new grad. It's a bad idea. You have a bad experience. We heard all those things. We still hear that consistently now from prospective travelers, students, especially when we go to like CSM conferences. CSM's coming up next month. We'll be there. We hear constantly, should I travel as a new grad? Is it a good idea? So you'll hear from professors, you'll hear from fellow clinicians, sometimes CIs and things, that you should not travel as a new grad. And I think the reason people say that, especially people that don't have any experience with traveling, is they hear the same horror stories that everyone else hears. They hear that some of the clinics are terrible and that you'll get thrown in and, you get the hard patients. They hear all that stuff. What they don't understand, I think, is most of those horror stories, we've talked about this before, come from people that did not do their research before they jumped into travel. You get put in clinics or areas that are bad and you hate it. And those are the stories that get circulated, not the good stories. And so we started traveling as new grads. We had a very good experience. We've mentored now, I would say, at least 2,000 others, but probably more than that, new grad therapists. And I would say 90 to 95% of them also have a good experience. Where some of the truth comes in here, and why I do think that some professors tell students not to travel, is that it certainly is not for everyone. So if you're going to make a blanket statement like you shouldn't travel, it's safer to say that than to say some people should, some people shouldn't. I would say, yeah, probably 90% of students are okay traveling, but there's definitely some people that should not travel right away. They should get some experience first. It's usually people that feel a little more uncertain with their clinical skills, or people that are a little more shy, introverted, people that don't do a good job speaking up for themselves. It's hard to travel because, you're coming out of school as a new grad, you're already uncertain with your skills, and you can easily get like pushed around, I would say, in some of your clinics, especially if managers are overbearing or they try to push you to do things that you shouldn't do. And, sometimes people feel overwhelmed with new patients and don't understand how to treat very well. And those people, yes, get a year or 2 experience before you travel. Most therapists that we talk to, most students that are like going out of their way, being proactive, trying to figure this stuff out before they start traveling, are not those types of students, though. They're usually the students that are going above and beyond. They're doing great. Their CIs give them great feedback, and those people are fine to travel. It's no issue with traveling as a new grad as long as you're prepared as a clinician.
Yeah, and there's a lot that you can do to get yourself prepared. So, of course, there's definitely, you want to be prepared as a clinician in your didactic and clinical education leading up to graduation. That's obviously the most important thing. You want to be a great clinician, ready to hit the ground running. But there's a lot you can also do to learn about travel therapy to set yourself up for success. And that's where we can come into play to help you. And that's where we've helped many dozens, hundreds, thousands of new grads to have a successful experience. So if you are in that camp, if you're a new grad or someone who's a student that's thinking about traveling as a new grad, start by reading all the free stuff on our website at traveltherapymentor.com. Listen to our podcast, go back and watch our videos. We have videos and podcasts and articles on just about every topic you could think of. So if you get yourself educated, you'll start to understand the right questions that you should be asking. You'll have an opportunity to talk to multiple recruiters. We recommend talking to at least 3 different recruiters so that you can learn more about the industry, identify good jobs that are going to be a good fit for you as a new grad. We can also help with that. If you want to fill out our recruiter recommendation form, we can save you a lot of the legwork by connecting you with recruiters that work well with new grads. We have some that work better than others with new grads in terms of providing you the mentorship and the guidance you need to have a good experience. They can point you in the direction of some travel therapy jobs that are going to be a good fit. Maybe they've had new grads there before. All these things can make such a difference in your experience as a traveler instead of just jumping into it blind, and then maybe you would have a bad experience. But trust that, this is definitely, in our opinion, a myth that you shouldn't travel as a new grad. It's always kind of like with everything, it depends.
Yep. I mean, we did it 10 years ago, and we've had a great experience with it. And like I said, we know tons of other new grads that have, and the majority of people have a good experience. There are just some people that do have a bad experience. Usually it's people that don't put themselves in a good position to start with. And then you hear those stories over and over and over. All right. So number 2, all travel jobs are bad. That's why they need a traveler. We hear that all the time. Again, back to the not traveling as a new grad, there is some truth to that. And that's the thing about a lot of the myths, is that there's a small amount of truth in all of these things. Like I said, there are people that shouldn't travel as a new grad, certainly. And just like this one, there's definitely some jobs that are bad. I would say probably 20% of jobs out there, maybe 20, 25% are not great jobs. The key is to weed those jobs out. There's a lot of ways you can do that. One, working with good recruiters, they can kind of point you in the direction of facilities they've had travelers there in the past that have had a good experience. So then you go into a facility that you at least know that there's been some other travelers there that had a good experience. Also, we harp over and over and over in our course and in these videos about how important the interview is, because if you interview well and you ask all the appropriate questions and you make sure it's a good fit for you, you're reducing your odds of getting a bad travel assignment by a lot. It's there. You definitely still will, if you travel for long enough, say 5 or 6 years, you probably get 1 or 2 bad assignments. We had a couple of bad assignments for sure. But you really reduce your chances if you interview well and you go out of your way to try to find these good jobs.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there are some bad travel jobs out there. Most of them are not bad jobs. That's not why they have an opening. Most of them, in our experience, the reason they have a travel opening is because they're either in a rural area that people aren't readily moving to. New grads aren't just chomping at the bit to go to this rural area and work there. Or they've recently had somebody quit, or they had a lot of these outpatient clinics. They're suddenly getting a ton of new patients, and they just need a traveler to try to fill in while they hire permanently. Because what we found is, in a lot of these like PT and OT and SLP groups, a lot of people are vying for jobs on the same cities. So if you want to be a therapist in Austin or Denver or San Diego or LA or New York, you're like, wow, the job market's saturated. But if you go anywhere outside of those places, they are desperate for therapists. And that's where most of travel jobs are. They're desperate for therapists. They're trying to hire perm. They can't find anybody, and they just need a traveler to fill in. It's not a bad contract or not a bad facility. It's just that they need somebody temporarily until they can hire a permanent person.
Yeah. Of course, there's always going to be bad jobs out there. There's going to be bad permanent jobs, just like there's going to be bad travel jobs. And that kind of goes back to the same thing with like, should you travel as a new grad? A lot of these jobs are just regular jobs that need a therapist. So as a permanent therapist, as a new grad, you could happen to live in that city and be applying for that same job. But it just happens to be, it's listed as a travel job because they're having trouble finding somebody permanent. So you might end up taking that same job that a new grad in that city could have taken. So they're just the same as regular jobs, right? So with that said, there are good regular jobs and there are bad regular jobs. It doesn't just mean the only reason they're open for a traveler is because they're a bad job and nobody wants to work there. Sometimes that is the case. Yes, that can be the case where they're having trouble keeping permanent staff because it's a bad place to work. But like Jared said, majority of the time it's not that. It's more just a staffing shortage, or it could also be like a seasonal thing. Sometimes there's an influx of patients to an area. Think like snowbirds, just different times of the year, where there might be more or less need for therapists. So there's a lot of different reasons why they might need a traveler, and it's not majority, I would say, because it's a bad place. But like Jared said, there are some bad ones out there, and the way that you can mitigate getting into those situations is by asking a lot of questions during the interview.
The third myth we hear pretty often is you don't get very good benefits or job security as a traveler. And again, there's a little bit of truth to this because you don't get things like sick pay and vacation time. And so sometimes people are like, oh, well, that's terrible. I would rather have vacation pay, sick time. But in terms of things like health insurance, 401k, all those other benefits that most people are talking about, you still get those through the travel company. It's no different than a permanent job. You still get health insurance that the recruiters have, and you still get 401k plan that the recruiters are eligible for. So it's a normal company, just like a normal therapy company would be. You're just working through the staffing company now. You get the same benefits they get. And as far as like vacation time, sick pay, what we talk about all the time is we would rather make more money and be able to fund our own vacations for longer periods than to have someone save money for us to give it to us for a vacation. So, if you work at a normal perm job and you're getting 3 weeks paid vacation per year, well, wouldn't you rather make double the money or 1.5 times the money for 6 months and then have that extra 6 months or 3 months or however long you choose to take off? You already have made enough money to cover that time off anyway. So that's the way we look at it. We don't look at that at all as a negative thing. It's just that you make more money up front so that you can save for your own vacation instead of having someone else save for you, essentially.
Yeah. And as far as the job security, if you guys have listened to our job market updates in the past, we just recently did one. The last one was a couple months ago in November. The job market is very solid for most disciplines, especially physical therapists, PTAs, pretty good for OT and SLP. The only discipline for therapy that the job market is not great right now is for CODA. But for any other discipline, there is very good job security as a travel therapist. You're not going to have much trouble finding consistent work, with the caveat to that being depending on how picky you are. So if you only want to take local contracts around one city, that's going to limit your options a lot more. Or if you only want to work in a very niche setting where there aren't a lot of travel therapy jobs, that could limit your job prospects. But for the most part, there's tons of travel therapy opportunities. As long as you're at least a little bit flexible on setting and or location, you're not going to have trouble finding consistent work as a traveler. And these are all things you need to understand prior to getting started as a traveler, by doing things like talking to us, talking to recruiters about your job prospects for what you're looking for. So, hash it out before you leave a permanent job or before you get started with travel therapy with a recruiter. Talk to them about like, these are the settings and states that I'm interested in. Is that realistic? Are you seeing a lot of jobs? Before you decide to get into it. But for the most part, you're not going to have trouble finding consistent work. We've never been without a job when we wanted to find work.
Yep. And we are more picky than the average traveler too, because there's 2 of us and we normally want outpatient, and half the time we want only part-time, which is really hard to find, and we still are able to find these contracts. So job security is definitely not an issue. If you want a job, you can find a job, as long, like Whitney said, assistance is a little more difficult, but for the most part, you can find contracts whenever you want.
Yeah.
If you have any questions or follow-up or any feedback about any of these things we're talking about, let us know. We'll go through those as we go as well.
Yeah. And if you are watching live, again, we'd just love you to say hi in the comments, hit the like button. We appreciate your support.
Okay, number 4, you'll be treated poorly at the facility because you're a traveler and because you make more money. So we hear this quite a bit. It seems to be very common in various therapy groups that you hear, oh, travelers get treated badly, travelers get the hard patients, travelers have to work more hours, all of those things. And I really don't know where that came from, because in our experience, I don't know how many contracts we've taken. I would say between the 2 of us, probably close to 30. And I would say of all those contracts, the majority of the time we get the easier caseload and the easier patients. There's only been maybe once or twice in all of our contracts where I felt like I was getting more difficult patients or anything like that. And the reason for that is you have to remember that most of these facilities, the permanent staff are salary. They're paying them a set amount of money no matter how many hours they work. The travelers are hourly. So why would the managers or the owners of these clinics want to give the travelers more work and harder patients? Because they have to pay them more money to stay there and do that work. Like if I'm working at an outpatient clinic and they give me 20 patients, well, now they have to pay me overtime to see all those patients and do all the documentation. So why would they give me more patients instead of the permanent staff that they're paying a set amount of money? And normally that's the way they look at it too. There are situations where you get to the clinic and they try to give you a big caseload, but then you write 44 hours on your timesheet and they're like, oh, I can't pay you overtime. And you say, Okay, well then I can't do this caseload, adjust it. And they do. So I think there are some travelers that have difficulty speaking up for themselves. I've definitely been in that situation. I have more trouble speaking up for myself than Whitney does. But there are some people that will let themselves get kind of pushed around, and those people, maybe they work 45 hours a week, but they only write down 40, and then it's like, oh, it's so hard being a traveler. But if you speak up for yourself and you say, I'm hourly, I clock in when I get here, I clock out when I leave, they're not going to make your schedule hard because they have to pay you more money. So that is definitely a myth unless you let the managers kind of push you around.
In addition to that, in terms of like the interpersonal relationships with your coworkers and your manager, as far as like being treated poorly or they look negatively upon you, we have never experienced that. And the majority of the time, like we mentioned, they need somebody really badly. And so a lot of times by the time we get there, they've been drowning in their caseloads and they really needed us to come and help and take off some of the workload or get in some evals that they've been trying to get in. So we've always, in our experience, had that they were so thankful that we were there, and they were really nice to us because they were like, oh my gosh, we're so glad you're here. We really need your help. Thank you for coming. So again, I don't know if like, I would say that when I've talked to travel nurses, it does seem like the vibe and the environment is a little bit different sometimes for travel nurses. I've heard sometimes, especially like in hospitals, that they'll treat the travel nurses worse than they treat the permanent nurses. But as therapists, we've never experienced that. They've always been thankful that we were there.
Yeah, I'm not really sure where that comes from. Maybe it is just from the nursing world, but yeah, everyone's always been nice to us. I mean, there's situations where we feel like we don't fit in the best, but I mean, that's fairly normal because a lot of this permanent staff, they already have their own families and their own friends and their own coworkers that they hang out with. And so there are situations where you might feel a little bit like an outsider, but no one's ever been mean to us because we're a traveler. So I'm not really sure where that came from.
Yeah.
The next one is you can't advance your skill set as a traveler or it slows down your career development. I wrote an article about this probably 2018 or 2017 when we had been traveling for a few years. And I pointed out in the article that like, if I had taken a permanent job, I compared myself to a lot of my classmates that went and took permanent jobs and they'd worked at the same clinic since we graduated. They worked maybe with one other therapist or maybe two other therapists, and they had not gotten a broad variety of experience with different clinicians, different settings. Whereas for me, by the time I'd worked 3 years out of school, I think I'd worked with like 40 different therapists. So in terms of career development and learning skill set and all that stuff, I feel like I got a major advantage on that early on because I got to learn from so many different therapists. And most therapists, kind of going back to the last thing, most therapists, when you come into a clinic, they're fine. Like if you see them working with a patient and they do something you're not familiar with and you say, hey, that thing you did, can you tell me about it? What's your reasoning? Can you show me? I've never had a therapist that was like, no, I'm not going to do that. They're like, oh yeah, great. Yeah, I want to teach you. And so I felt like I learned a lot more working with all these different people, different patient populations, different settings than I ever would have if I'd taken a permanent job and just, worked with the same one or two other therapists and done the same stuff, getting the same routine. So I think it depends on how you look at things because people think of like mentorship as like, okay, I'm going to go in the clinic and someone's going to teach me how to treat. Usually that's not how mentorship is. It's like, if you have questions, for perm jobs, if you have questions, ask me. Well, the same thing, it's the same way for travelers. When I go to a new clinic, they say like, oh, if you have questions, let me know. And so it's really not that different. And I think the big advantage as a traveler is that you get to work with so many different clinicians. So if anything, I would say that my skill set and my career development has been better as a traveler than it would have been if I had taken a perm job and just worked at the same clinic this whole time.
And when it comes to things like getting advanced certifications or continuing education, you can definitely still do that while you're a traveler. We know lots of travelers that take courses, have gotten advanced certifications while being a traveler. Now, there are certain elements to this, like learning from fellow clinicians, getting advanced certifications, having the time and the ability to do in-person courses, where it would be easier if you were more settled in one place instead of hopping around. So if that's something that's very important to you, what we would encourage you to do is try to find contracts that are longer. Maybe stay for 6 months or 9 months or a year, and then you get a lot more of that stability and that ability to like sit for like a multi-session course if you need to, or maybe follow your patient, your caseload through a full course of rehab. That's one thing that I do feel like I've missed out on a little bit by hopping around to different clinics. Like I don't think I've ever done a full ACL rehab all the way through because you usually kind of come into it. Even if you start the patient, you're only there for 3 months for the first 3 months, or you might come into it in the middle of their rehab. So there are some elements, again, like we said, for all these myths, there are some elements of truth to some of it. But there are definitely strategies and ways that you can still develop your career and skill set as a traveler. You just may have to, it might look a little bit different.
And one other thing I would add to that, I guess, if you were the type of therapist that really wants to do like a residency or a fellowship and you want to dive really deeply into a certain practice area, then yeah, maybe you would have a difference there. But that we were never the therapist that wanted to go through a residency or a fellowship. We had interest in various settings and did not really want to niche down so much into one area. So,
but even if you do, like we've talked to a lot of people that do that right after graduation and then go into travel therapy or vice versa. So you can still fit that into your career goals and plans while still utilizing the benefits of travel therapy at some point in your career. But you just have to use different strategies and find what works best for you.
Yep.
All right. So the next myth that we're going to cover is travelers don't care about their work or patients. They're just there to get in and out and make money. Actually, I had a manager that said this to me at one of my very first contracts. I can't remember if he said it to my face or if he said it like to the other staff and then it got around to me. But basically he was like, oh, well, of course, she's just not going to care about the patients because she's just here to get in and get out and make money. And I was really taken aback by that because obviously I feel like I'm a good clinician and I really did care about the patients and I really was there to help. But that was his impression of me when I first got there. And so I definitely think that's a misconception about travel therapists. Yeah, I'm sure there are some bad therapists out there that's the case. They're just trying to make a buck and, hop in and hop out and they don't actually care. But I would say that most clinicians are good clinicians, care about their work. I definitely think that you can be a valuable asset to a team. Quite often you can come with an outside perspective and bring something new to them and make positive impacts. So I definitely think that that's a myth.
Yeah, again, I kind of think this is one of those things where there's a grain of truth and that probably the bad experiences that these managers and clinics have spread a lot more. The story spread a lot more than the good ones. And so maybe they had a bad traveler we've heard stories about bad travelers as well. And I'm sure there's situations, especially back before the internet or, back in the 90s, early 2000s, where if say someone got in trouble in one state as a therapist, maybe they're getting licensed and moving to another state, and maybe that's a stigma that happened with therapists. But obviously, in the digital age, that stuff follows you around. It's not like you can just run away from your indiscretions or whatever as a therapist. So, I don't know. I don't think that's really a thing anymore. I'm sure there definitely are bad travelers out there, but there's bad clinicians no matter whether you're a traveler or a permanent therapist.
Yeah. So go out there and do good. Don't be one of those bad travelers that gives us a bad rap.
For sure.
All right. The next myth that we're going to cover, taxes are really difficult and confusing as a traveler. So I might have thought this too when I
did too.
When I was new, because I didn't, well, for one, I went into travel therapy straight as a new grad and I had never filed taxes before. So I didn't understand taxes. And so Jared kind of did the research on it and helped me to understand it better. And I quickly learned that it really is not that confusing, especially now with software where you can do it, online yourself. All you do is just type in the numbers that you get on your W-2. It's really not that hard.
Yeah, we made a couple videos about this over the years, but it's really not hard. You're a W-2 employee just through the travel company, just like you would be through a normal therapy company. Your stipends, that's already accounted for in the back end by the travel company. There's nothing you need to do on your tax return for your stipends. Everything is pretty simple. The only additional difficulty versus doing taxes regularly is that you have to file for multiple states if you work in multiple states. And that's really not that difficult. Most software, when you put in your W-2s and it shows like, oh, you had withholdings in Virginia and North Carolina and California, it will automatically generate those different state income returns and will help you walk you through it. So really not difficult. I think most people, if you're completely uncertain or you don't even want to deal with it, just get an accountant. It's maybe $400 or $500 a year to have them help you with your taxes. Not a huge deal, but I think most people with just a little bit of research and a little bit of trial and error, you can figure it out. Before we started traveling, I had never filed taxes on my own at all. So my first year doing it was as a traveler and filing for multiple states, and it was not a big deal. I did mine in Whitney. So I think most people can figure it out. You just do a little bit of research and put in a little bit of effort, and it's not a big deal at all.
Yeah, it's really not that bad. If you want to learn more about that, really, if you want to learn more about any of the topics that we're talking about in this video, we have more in-depth videos and articles on pretty much every single one of these topics, but particularly about taxes because we are in tax season right now. We've got an article and we've got a video talking about how to file taxes and all that if you want to go back and check those out. We also have a CPA that we work with who works a lot with travel healthcare providers. So if you're not feeling confident about doing it yourself, send us a message and we can give you her information. And she'll also give you 10% off your tax filing services if you let her know that we referred you to her. So.
Now, kind of along those same lines, why people kind of think that things are so complicated is that there is a belief that you can write off a bunch of expenses as a traveler. This was the case back probably 10 years or more, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. You were able to write off expenses as a W-2 employee. But that has changed now. The tax law is different. You can't write off expenses as a W-2 employee. The standard deduction is really high now. So most people are not itemizing. I would say 99% of people are not itemizing their taxes anyway. So most people are taking the standard deduction. You don't have a lot of itemized deductions to deal with. You can't write off work expenses anyway. So none of that really even applies. You can't really write off much at all as a normal traveler. If you take 1099 contracts and you're traveling that way, then that's completely different. You can write off lodging and meals and incidentals, but as a W-2 traveler, you get stipends for those things. So that is basically in lieu of you writing off those things. You're getting reimbursed for those expenses. So that is not a concern. You don't really need to worry about, oh, well, what about, how do I write off this and how do I account for this? None of that really applies anymore. You just put what's on your W-2, you file the multiple state returns, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, it's honestly really straightforward. Like we said, the travel company sends you a W-2. The only reason you'll get multiple W-2s is if you worked for more than one travel company or if you worked in more than one state. And you just follow the prompts on the software and it talks you through the whole thing. You just enter the numbers as they're listed. You don't worry about any additional write-offs. You say, I'm taking the standard deduction. This is the only reason, like Jared said, that you would maybe do something else would be if you had your own business outside of being a travel therapist. You had an LLC of some sort for something else, or you were doing 1099 employment for some other type of job. But majority of travelers are working as a W-2 employee through the staffing agency. And it's very simple to file your taxes. You don't have to worry about any additional write-offs or anything like that.
And then to make things even better, we made a video about this probably 2019 or 2020. Most travelers can file for free using these online softwares too, because they have stipulations where if you have below a certain income, you don't have to pay to file your taxes. And for travelers, that only applies to your taxable portion of your income, which is usually pretty low. So for us, for our first 5 years traveling, we didn't pay to do our taxes at all. So if anything, it's cheaper and a little bit easier. Well, I wouldn't say easier. It's cheaper and only a little bit more hassle to file taxes as a traveler as it is to file taxes as a permanent employee. Yeah,
and just to reiterate what he said there, because you're only putting what they put on your W-2 income, that's only the taxable portion of your pay. So that's what makes your pay look lower when we've gone into detail in these videos about your HEI and all that stuff, and how you're actually, it looks like you make less money. It's because your stipends don't go on there at all. If you're receiving these untaxed stipends, listen to that, untaxed. So you don't put it on your tax return because they're untaxed stipends. So we get that question all the time. Where do I put the stipends in all
They don't show up at all in your tax return. That's all handled by the travel company. That is an expense of the travel company. So that doesn't even factor into your tax return at all.
Yep. So it's actually really pretty straightforward.
Yep.
All right, so we're coming up on the last 2 myths that we're going to cover here. Again, if you are watching live, we'd love if you'd hit the thumbs up button, say hi in the comments, ask us any questions that you have about either these 10 myths that we're going over or just general travel therapy questions. We'd be happy to answer them. And then shout out to those of you that will listen later on the replay as well.
All right, another one we hear very often is a job only has to be 50 miles from home to be considered a travel job. So all the time we'll hear people say, well, there's this job in the county over. I want to travel, but I want to live at home, but it's 55 miles away, so I want to take it as a traveler. That's not the way travel therapy works. If you're someone that just wants to live at home and take jobs around your home, then you can do that, but that's not how traditional travel works. You don't get tax-free stipends for doing that. So the tax-free stipends that we talk about in all these videos, the reason travel is so lucrative, you have to be duplicating expenses. So you can't just be living at home and commuting 55 miles, and just because it's more than 50 miles from home, you take the stipends, you make the extra money. It doesn't work that way. If you ever get audited, you'd have to pay that back with interest and penalties. So 50 miles doesn't really factor in. It has more to do with how far away, if it's a commutable distance from your house, and are you actually living somewhere else to work that job. So the IRS doesn't care if you drive 100 miles to a contract if you're driving 100 miles back home every night. They care is it far enough away that you need to have a different dwelling to live in temporarily, And in that case, you're paying expenses at home and you're paying expenses here. Okay, now you get the tax-free stipends. So the mileage does not matter. It has to be outside of a commutable distance, which means you can't be driving back and forth, and you have to be duplicating your housing expenses.
Yeah. And so why is this myth so common? Why do you hear it all the time? Why do you maybe even hear it from your recruiter? Well, the reason is that some of the staffing companies internally, as a rule, have created this kind of rule of thumb of about 50 miles, just to make it easy. So sometimes
it's a mechanism to weed out situations where someone is trying to skirt around the rules. They're like, okay, if it's more than 50 miles, chances are they're not living at home because it's far enough away. But there are situations certainly where you still can commute. And so the travel companies developed a 50-mile rule, so as like a sorting mechanism. Like, okay, if it's less than 50 miles, they're probably going to be living at home. They can't get tax-free stipends. But if it's more than 50 miles, they probably are not living at home and they can get tax-free stipends. So the recruiters and the companies now, some of them just think, oh, if it's more than 50 miles, it's fine. If it's less, it's not. But that's just an internal rule that they came up with to try to weed people out.
Yeah, but again, remember, it's not really the travel company that you're accountable to when it comes to this tax stuff. It's the IRS. So they're using that as a rule of thumb, a sorting mechanism to try to make sure you're doing the right thing, but they're not always going to check. It's not necessarily their job to check and make sure that you're not commuting home every night. What are they going to do? Put a camera on your car? Or that, make you turn in the bill every month that says that you did duplicate expenses? They're not going to do that. Sometimes what they will do is make you sign a statement, like an attestation that says, I am duplicating expenses. This is my permanent address, and I agree that in order to receive these tax-free stipends, I'm going to be living, elsewhere for this contract. So sometimes they might do that just to kind of like CYA, to like cover themselves. But really it's your responsibility. So you could still hear some of the recruiters, especially the ones that aren't as educated on the nuances of this, just kind of like off the cuff say like, well, it has to be 50 miles away or more. But truly there's nothing in the literature from the IRS that says there's any set mileage. If you go deep into what the IRS says, it just says it can't be within a reasonable commutable distance.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's going to vary depending on your city, your metro area, what's considered a commutable distance. But yeah, this is a very common one. We actually did a video a couple months ago and wrote an article called "How Far Away from Home Does It Have to Be a Travel Job?" If you are somebody that still has questions about this, I would highly recommend you go read that article and watch that video.
And this is also a reason why you can't take tax advice or anything like that from your recruiter, because like Whitney said, some don't know. Some do know, and they just don't care because they're like, hey, this doesn't matter to me. If you get audited, it's not a big deal. And also the chances of you getting audited are low. So who cares? If you want to say that it's a travel job and you want to commute, say it. And if it's more than 50 miles, you'll get the stipends, and you only ever have to deal with that if you get audited. But it doesn't matter to them. If you get audited 5 years in the future and you have to prove it, it's not going to impact them at all. It's going to impact you. So some of them will even just say like, if you want to say that you're living somewhere else, great. I don't care. So just don't take tax advice from your recruiter. Like, it's not their responsibility. It's yours, and they're not going to be in trouble if something happens. It's going to be you.
I've even heard some like bad recruiters, some shady recruiters be like, yeah, just put your aunt's address. Like, it's fine. Do you have like a different address you could use? And then we'll make it work. I'll write it on the piece of paper and like, it's fine.
Yep.
But that's not good advice. You should not be taking this advice of like, could you just put your aunt's address down? No, don't be doing shady stuff like this, because it's not going to come back on that recruiter. If you get audited by the IRS and they say you owe back taxes for money that you should have been taxed on, you can't be like, but my recruiter, they don't care about your recruiter.
Yeah.
Stop taking tax advice from recruiters. Stop taking tax advice from non-tax professionals, from other travelers in Facebook groups. Take tax advice from tax professionals. Read the IRS rules yourself. Or if not, if you want to skirt the rules and take a chance, well, just understand that you're taking a risk and you need to own that responsibility.
Yep. Okay, the very last one, this is something we heard pretty often when we first started traveling, and I started writing about travel a lot. You don't actually make more money as a traveler after you account for all of your expenses. So I think that less people feel that way since 2020 or 2021 pay started going up a lot. I haven't heard it as much, but back in 2015, 2016, 2017, there's a lot of people that are like, well, why would I travel? Once you account for duplicating expenses and getting to contracts and time off and all that, you really don't make any more money. And there were situations where if you work in a location, say Nevada's a really high paying area, and they pay their permanent staff really well. There are situations where you might actually not make that much more as a traveler, than if you were just working a perm job at a high paying job. But for the majority of people, if you take the average traveler and the average therapist, you make 1.5 to 2 times as much as a traveler as you would at a permanent job. So it is significantly more money, even for accounting for expenses and accounting for all of that, time off, you still make more money. For us, most of our contracts, when we accounted for all of our additional expenses, we were still making about 1.5 times more than we would have made, or being able to save 1.5 times more than we would have if we took permanent jobs in our hometown. So, we would have been taking out of school, new grads, we would have taken jobs making probably 72,000 in an outpatient clinic. And most of our travel jobs we were taking, that's gross pay. Travel jobs working throughout the full year, we were making somewhere close to 100,000 a year after taxes. So huge difference there. So it just really depends on the jobs you're taking. It depends on a lot of different factors, but most people, if you take the average, they're going to make significantly more traveling, and they'll be able to take more time off, and they'll be able to save more, put more money towards their loans than if you were working a permanent job.
Yeah, I think with everything, it depends, right?
Yeah.
Because we get some people that are like, they're already maxing out the amount they should be able to make realistically. They're like, well, I make 150,000 somehow, as a therapist, and I'm like, okay, well, if you're making 150,000, like maybe you're not going to make more as a traveler, or if you only want to go to Hawaii and the cost of living is really high and the math isn't mathing, right? So in certain situations, you may not make more as a traveler, but I would say the majority of people, you do make more as a traveler. But of course, as with anything, you have to just be a little bit savvy, right? Like if your primary objective is to make a lot of money, you need to look at the moderate to high paying contracts in the moderate to low cost of living areas. You need to be good with your money. You need to save. You need to not just like blow all the extra money if your objective is to save money.
Yeah, very often when I used to write about this and people would push back, it'd be people that would say like, well, I make 120,000 in my permanent job. How am I going to make more traveling? I'm like, you're not going to make more traveling, but how many people do you know that make 120,000 at a permanent job, especially new grads? So, if you're the average person, new grads are making 70, maybe 75,000 now. You make a lot more than that as a traveler. But, if you're at the top end of your pay range and you're getting paid really well, then yeah, sure, stay at your permanent job.
Yeah. All right, so that is all the myths that we wanted to cover on tonight's video. Again, if you guys have any questions about any of these topics that we discussed, feel free to send us a message, dive deeper into some of our YouTube and our podcasts, or the articles on our website to learn more on each of these topics. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I don't think there were any questions in the comments.
Yeah, I don't think I saw any.
So, all right, thanks for those that tuned in live, and thanks to those of you that will watch later.
Yep. All right, take care, everyone.
All right, bye.
Bye.